want to start at the end. Not the end you're afraid of, the actual end, the last page. Open the last book of the Bible to its final 2 chapters, and here's what you find. There is no fire. There is no mushroom cloud. There is no army of demons swallowing the earth. There is a city. There is a river running down the middle of a street, clear as glass. There are trees on both banks, and the text says their leaves are for the healing of the nations. And then the scene becomes almost unbearably personal. Not thunder, not a throne of terror, an image you would not expect to find at the end of the world, a hand reaching down toward a human face. The text says that God himself will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death, no more mourning, no more crying, no more pain, because the old order of things has passed away. That is the end. That is where every major end times prophecy in the Bible is going, not toward annihilation, toward a face, toward a tear, toward someone arriving who has wanted for a very long time to be close enough to touch you. So why are you so afraid of it? Here is what I think happened. Somewhere in the last 100 years, we took the most comforting collection of writings in human history and turned it into a horror movie. We made it about codes and calendars and countdowns. We made it about being left behind. And here is the part almost no channel will tell you. Read the scariest chapters slowly, and you start to notice that the words which keep returning are not words of panic. They are words of comfort. Do not be alarmed. Encourage one another. Lift up your heads. They sit right in the middle of the darkest passages again and again, and once you start hearing them, you cannot read these chapters the same way. So tonight we are going to do something backwards. We just stood at the end. Now we are going to walk back through every major end times prophecy that leads there, in the order the fear arrives, and I am going to show you what the text actually says. And pay attention to the tense, because most of these were not written about a far-off future. They were written to people who were already drowning. This is not a story about a date on a calendar, not a code to crack, not a countdown to survive. This is a story about a person who already saw the worst day of your life coming, wrote it into the script, and then wrote past it. Let's go back. The first place the fear arrives is a hillside outside Jerusalem. Picture it in the present tense, because that is how it happened. Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives. It is the last week of his life, though the men around him do not know that yet. 4 of them come to him privately. Mark even names them, Peter, James, John, and Andrew. And they ask the question you have asked at 2 in the morning. When is it going to end? What are the signs? Now watch what he does. Because everyone quotes the disasters that come next, and almost nobody quotes the first thing out of his mouth. Before the wars, before the earthquakes, before any of it, Jesus says, see to it that you are not alarmed. That is the opening line of the most famous end-time sermon ever preached. Not panic, not prepare for the worst. Do not be alarmed. Then he describes it. Wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, famines, earthquakes in various places. And here is the line that should have changed everything, the line that gets skipped on every doom channel on the internet. He calls all of it the beginning of birth pains. Birth pains. Think about what that image is doing. Birth pains are not the signs that someone is dying. They are the signs that someone is being born. They are painful, they are frightening, and they mean something is coming, not ending. So when you lie awake tonight scrolling headlines, another war, another quake, another collapse, and your chest tightens because it feels like the end, the text is not arguing with your eyes. It agrees the world groans. It just refuses to let you call the groaning a death rattle when God calls it a delivery room. Then Jesus says something harder. He warns of an abomination that causes desolation standing where it should not, and he tells the people in Judea to run for the mountains. And here is where honest scholarship gets uncomfortable, so I am going to be honest with you. Many serious Christians believe a large part of this was already fulfilled, that within one generation, in the year 70, Roman armies surrounded Jerusalem, the temple was burned, and the people who remembered these words ran, exactly as he said. The text even has Jesus say, "This generation will not pass away until all these things have happened." Other serious Christians believe that points forward to something still ahead. I am not going to pretend to settle for you in one sentence what the church has not settled in 2,000 years. But notice this, whichever way you read it, the instruction was never be terrified. The instruction was, when you see it, move and do not lose heart. And then, at the center of the whole sermon, Jesus says the sentence that should end every date-setting video forever. He says that about that day and hour, no one knows. Not the angels, not even the Son, only the Father. Sit with how strange that is. The Son of God standing there, telling you that he is not handing out the date. So if he would not give a date, what exactly are people doing when they sell you one? Here is the part nobody tells you. He withheld the date on purpose, because a date would make you watch a calendar, and he did not want you watching a calendar. He wanted you watching for him. But where did all this machinery even come from? The beasts, the thrones, the figure riding the clouds. For that, you have to go back further, about 600 years further, to a man sitting in a foreign palace, far from home. His name is Daniel. He is a Hebrew exile in Babylon, a prisoner of war who rose to serve the very empire that destroyed his city, and the strange machinery that fills the book of Revelation, the beasts, the kingdoms, the thrones. Most of it is being assembled in the present tense in the dreams of this homesick young man. In one dream, King Nebuchadnezzar sees a towering statue, head of gold, chest of silver, belly of bronze, legs of iron, feet of iron mixed with clay. Daniel tells him each section is a kingdom, one after another, rising and falling across the centuries. And then a stone, cut by no human hand, strikes the statue and shatters the whole thing, and the stone grows into a mountain that fills the entire earth. That stone, Daniel says, is a kingdom that will never be destroyed. Read that again. The point of the vision is not the empires. Empires fall in every chapter of human history. The point is the stone that outlasts all of them. Stay with me, because the second dream is stranger. Daniel sees 4 monstrous beasts come up out of a churning sea, a lion, a bear, a leopard, and then a fourth. And here is a detail worth slowing down for. The first 3 each get an animal. The fourth one gets none. The text simply calls it dreadful and terrifying and strong, as if no living creature was monstrous enough to stand in for it. And from that fourth beast rises a small horn with a mouth speaking arrogant things. This is the origin of almost every Antichrist image you have ever seen. But watch what the vision does next, because this is the part that matters. The scene cuts away from the monsters. A throne is set up. One called the Ancient of Days takes his seat, his clothing white as snow, and 10,000 times 10,000 stand before him. The court sits, the books are opened, and the loud-mouthed horn, for all its noise, is simply switched off. And then comes the line that Jesus himself would quote on the worst night of his life. Daniel says he saw one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven, approaching the Ancient of Days, and being given authority and glory and a kingdom that will never pass away. In the original Aramaic, the phrase is bar enash. It just means a human being, a son of man. But here that human being is riding the clouds, which in the ancient world only God did. A human doing what only God does. Hold on to that. Hundreds of years later, on trial for his life, when the high priest demands to know who he is, Jesus answers by quoting this exact verse. He looks at the men about to kill him and tells them they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. He was not inventing a title. He was reaching back into Daniel's lonely vision and saying, "That one is me." Daniel's book ends with the clearest and most direct promise of personal resurrection in the Hebrew Bible. He writes that many who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life. And to those who are wise, he says, they will shine like the brightness of the heavens, like the stars forever and ever. A prisoner of war, far from home, with no reason left to hope, is told that the dust is not the end of the people he loved. So if you are lying awake tonight, grieving someone, one of the oldest end times promises in the Bible was written for you. It did not start as a warning. It started as a sunrise promised to people sleeping in the dark. Now we arrive at the part of the story that empties churches and fills comment sections, the part everyone calls the rapture. It comes from a letter, and you have to know who it was written to. Picture the church at Thessalonica. They are new believers. They were told Jesus was coming back, and soon, and they believed it with their whole hearts.
And then their people started to die. A husband, a mother, a child. People they had been sure would see the Lord return with their own eyes, lowered into the ground before it happened. And now they are standing over fresh graves, and a horrible question is eating them alive. Did they miss it? Are the ones we buried gone for good? Did they fall asleep one day too early and lose everything? Sit in that with them for a moment, because Paul did. He does not open with a chart. He does not open with a timeline. He opens like a man kneeling down next to people who are wrecked. He tells them that he does not want them grieving like people who have no hope. And then, here is what he actually says. The Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, and the dead in Christ will rise first. First. The very people they had been weeping over go first. Then, he says, those who are still alive will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. In Greek, that phrase caught up is one word, harpazo. It means to be seized, snatched, grabbed suddenly. When this letter was translated into Latin centuries later, harpazo became the word that gives us the English term rapture. So when you hear that word, understand its root. It does not mean vanish. It means grabbed and pulled close, the way you would yank someone you love out of the path of a car. But here is the line everything was building toward, the reason Paul wrote any of it. After describing the whole scene, he does not say, so calculate the timing. He says, therefore, encourage one another with these words. That is the purpose statement, written right into the text. These words were given as a tool, and the tool was comfort. You are holding a passage that was designed on purpose to be read out loud at a funeral. Now, I have to be honest about the difficulty, because this is exactly where so many videos lie to you by leaving things out. Christians deeply disagree about the timing of all this. Some believe in a secret catching away years before a final tribulation. Some believe it happens in the middle. Some believe it happens at the very end as one single event with the second coming. And here is a fact most channels will never say out loud. The popular idea of a separate, secret rapture happening years before a final tribulation is not what the church taught for most of its history. Historians generally trace its rise to the early 1800s, to figures like Edward Irving, and then, far more influentially, to a man named John Nelson Darby, who did not so much invent the idea as build it into a system and spread it across the English-speaking world. That does not automatically make it wrong, but it should make you gentle with anyone who reads it differently and suspicious of anyone who tells you their chart is the only faithful one. Paul writes about one more figure in a second letter, a man of lawlessness, someone who exalts himself, held back for now by something the text calls a restrainer. It is one of the most debated passages in the entire Bible, and I am not going to pretend it is simple. But notice, even here, Paul's goal is not to whip them into fear. He opens that very section by begging them not to become easily unsettled or alarmed. There it is again. Do not be alarmed. You are hearing the refrain now. Keep listening for it. Which brings us, finally, to the book that scares people most, Revelation.
So picture the man who wrote it. It is a hot day on a small rocky island in the Aegean Sea. The island is called Patmos, and it is the kind of place Rome sends people to disappear. There is an old man here. His name is John. He may be the last one left alive of the circle that actually walked with Jesus. Gray now, worn down, exiled for refusing to stop talking about a crucified carpenter as though he were Lord of the world. He is cut off from the churches he loves. He cannot reach them. He can only lie awake, imagining what is happening to them. out there under an empire that is beginning to demand that people call the emperor a god and beginning to make life very dangerous for anyone who will not. He is alone. The text says it is the Lord's day and that he is in the Spirit when behind him he hears a voice like a trumpet. Watch what he does. An old, exiled, grieving man with every earthly reason to give up turns around toward the voice, and heaven starts pouring its visions out onto the page in front of him. And this matters more than any single symbol in the book. Revelation was not written to frighten comfortable people in a distant future. It was written to encourage terrified people in an immediate present. It is, at its heart, resistance literature for people living under a boot. So when you read the disasters that come in waves, the seals, the trumpets, the bowls poured out across the earth, understand the emotional logic running underneath them. To a believer being crushed by Rome, the message is not, be afraid of what is coming. The message is, the empire crushing you right now is not nearly as permanent as it looks, and it does not get the last word. That is why the book keeps cutting away from the chaos on earth to show you a throne in heaven that never stops being occupied. Every time the storm gets loud down here, the camera lifts up there and the throne is still there. Someone is still seated. Someone is still holding it all. But there is one number people have built more fear out of than almost anything else in the Bible, and it is time we looked at it honestly. 666. So here is what the text plainly says and what scholars actually think. The text says the number is the number of a man, and it openly invites the reader to calculate it. In the ancient world, letters doubled as numbers, so every name carried a numerical value. And one of the strongest scholarly explanations is almost embarrassingly down to earth. Take the name of the Emperor Nero, in the specific form Neron Caesar, spell it out in Hebrew letters, add up the values, and you land right on that number. If that reading is right, the terrifying beast was not a barcode, not a microchip, not some future world leader. It was a Caesar the first readers could name. A real tyrant in their real city, dressed up in code so the letter could survive being intercepted by the wrong eyes. I want to be careful here because the Nero reading is a leading scholarly view, not a settled fact, and faithful people land in other places. But notice what even the possibility does to your fear. It pulls the monster out of some unknown future and sets it down in a real first-century street, where a real church needed to be told that the man terrorizing them was already on God's clock. The armies gather at a place the text calls Armageddon, and here is a small thing that does enormous work. Armageddon is not a spiritual abstraction. In Hebrew, it is Har Megiddo, the mountain or hill of Megiddo. Megiddo is a real location in northern Israel, a plain where ancient armies actually fought for centuries, simply because of where the roads met. John reaches for the most blood-soaked battlefield his readers knew and uses it as a symbol for the final collision between every arrogant power and the throne it can never topple. Then you reach the 1,000 years, the Millennium, and I have to tell you the truth, which is that Christians have read this one chapter at least 3 completely different ways for the entire history of the church. Some read it as a literal future 1,000-year reign on earth after Jesus returns. Some read it as a symbol of the present age, the whole stretch of time between his first coming and his second. Some read it as a golden era the church grows into before he returns. These are not the views of cranks. Each one has been held by brilliant, faithful, careful readers for centuries. 3 readings, 2,000 years of argument, 0 settled dates, and the one thing all 3 of them agree on: the throne at the end is occupied. This is the honest difficulty I promised I would not skip. We do not all agree. The early Christians, in a text called the Didache, often dated to the late 1st or early 2nd century, wrote about the last days and the coming of the Lord, and even they described the signs without ever handing out a date. 2,000 years of the smartest believers who ever lived, and the consistent posture has been the same. We know the destination, we argue about the route, and we do not know the day. which is exactly why date setting has such a long, embarrassing history. Let me give you one name because it is more useful than 1,000 vague warnings. In the 1840s, a sincere, devout American preacher named William Miller became convinced he had finally cracked the timeline. He and tens of thousands of followers concluded the world would end on a specific day, October 22nd in the year 1844. People sold their farms, they gave away their possessions, they settled their accounts and said their goodbyes. Many of them waited through that night together, in homes and churches and meeting houses, certain that before morning they would see the Lord return. And the sun came up the next day on a world that was still here. They called it ever after the Great Disappointment. And they were not stupid people. They were not faithless people. They were good people who made the one mistake Jesus told them not to make. They set a date he said no one was given. So, when the next confident voice tells you they have the year, remember that morning. Remember the goodbyes that did not need to be said. And remember the only sane response to a date no one was given. You stop staring at the calendar, and you start living like he could come tonight, which mostly just means being the kind of person you would not be ashamed for him to find.
Now let me take you back to where we started, the end. We have walked through all of it now. The birth pains on the hillside, the beasts in Daniel's dreams, the dead rising at the trumpet, the throne behind the storm, the monster who turned out to be a Caesar, the battlefield with a real name. And every single road, no matter how dark, was pointing at the same place. The city, the river, the trees, the hand reaching down to a face. So here is the first thing that is simply true, that you can hold on to tonight no matter which chart you believe. The prophecies do not actually disagree about where this is going. They argue about the route. They agree about the destination. And the destination is not destruction. It is reunion. It is a wedding in the language of the text. It is the moment the distance between God and the people he made finally closes for good. Here is the second thing, the part that is about you. Every time the fear shows up in these chapters, a voice shows up right behind it. On the hillside, do not be alarmed. In the letter to grieving people, encourage one another with these words. In Luke's version of the sermon, when everything is shaking, Jesus says something almost outrageous. He says, "When these things begin to happen, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." Everyone else is told to look down and brace. You are told to look up. That is the difference these prophecies were always meant to make in a body lying awake in the dark. And here is the last thing, the thing I most need you to hear if you have made it this far tonight. You have been told, maybe your whole life, that the end of the world is something to survive, a gauntlet, a test you might fail, a door that might close before you reach it. But go back and read the last page again. God does not arrive at the end of all things with a list and a frown. He arrives the way a parent crosses a hospital room toward a child who has been crying for hours. He arrives, and the first thing he does, before the new heavens, before the new earth, before anything else, the first thing he does is reach down and wipe the tears off your face with his own hand. That was always the point, not the date, the face. The prophecies were never written to frighten people who are safe. They were written to comfort people who are suffering. And if tonight you are the one who is suffering, if you are the one who cannot sleep, who keeps reading the headlines, who keeps wondering if you are bringing your children into a world that is ending, then understand that these chapters were not aimed over your head at some far-off generation. They were aimed at you. The whole strange, frightening, beautiful book has been trying to get one message to you across 2,000 years of noise. Someone saw the end coming. He wrote past it, and he wrote your name on the other side. So do not be afraid. He kept saying it, passage after passage, hillside and letter and vision, because he knew it was the thing you would need most when the night got dark. Now I want to hear from you. When you read about the end times, what does your body feel first? Fear or hope? Tell me the truth in the comments and tell me why. I read them. And whatever you wrote there tonight, lift up your heads.